First of all, on your worksheets, this word witness should read archaeological, non-biblical archaeological corroboration. First of all, there's this guy named Quirinius who is referenced in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, at the time of Jesus' birth. However, archaeologists up until the 19th century thought that this guy was reigning from AD 5 to 6, which makes a problem because Jesus was born BC 4 to 6. However, what recent discoveries have found, or not too recent because this was back in the 19th century, was that this guy Quirinius was also in power before the alleged dates of AD 5 through 6. They know this because they found inscriptions on coins, and those coins point to Quirinius being present starting as early as 12 BC, being in power in a number of regions in the ancient Near East. Also, another piece of evidence they found is an inscription at the base of a statue erected in Pisidian Antioch. The inscription on this statue also putting Quirinius in power at the time when Jesus was born. So as a result, we can conclude that this AD 5 through 6 date aren't the only dates that Quirinius was in power. Next, we're going to move to Lysanias. Lysanias was referenced in Luke chapter 3 as being in power during the work and ministry of John the Baptist. However, our old friend Josephus, who we mentioned earlier, said that Lysanias was in power from 40 to 36 BC. Now that causes a problem because that's at least 40 years, probably more like 50 years, before John the Baptist was even out and about. However, again, archaeology has come to the rescue and has shown us that there actually was also a ruler named Lysanias who was in power from AD 14 to 37, which places him in charge at the right time. This guy, as mentioned by Josephus, was a king, whereas this guy was a tetrarch, which means he was one of 4 people in power. And so that helps us out quite a bit because Luke also refers to Lysanias as a tetrarch. Next, we'll move to the next piece of information, which is the Pool of Bethesda. Bethesda is the story, if you remember, where there's that angel that comes and stirs up the water so that people can get healed, and then Jesus comes in and heals some guy and says, hey, the water's irrelevant. I'm not sure if you remember that story or not, but it was one of those stories in which there was a little bit of a textual artifact in it. Nevertheless, some people have said, well, this Pool of Bethesda thing that John mentions in his gospel, it doesn't really exist, so we can know that the gospels aren't trustworthy. However, archaeological excavations have found that the Pool of Bethesda does actually exist, and the pool looks like this. Well, it does today. It looks like a big pile of rocks below the level of the ground around it. Now, what you'll notice in all of the excavations in Israel is when we're looking at things that are from the time of Jesus, about 2,000 years ago, it ends up being way lower underground because of the amount of times that Jerusalem was destroyed and rebuilt. Nevertheless, what we do know is that these areas in here were where the Pool of Bethesda would have been located, and now we have this location confirmed, so we can say, actually, yes, that Pool of Bethesda thing, it did actually happen. Look, there's a place. Bam. The next piece of evidence we have is that Pool of Siloam. At the Pool of Siloam, there was a blind man who was healed and made able to see. This actually wasn't originally an archaeological expedition because what you'll notice right here, this pipe up here, is a sewage pipe. They were laying new sewer piping and then they found these stairs that looked like they were from ancient times. And turns out they were. This is part of the Siloam runoff, and so what people would do is they would come down these stairs and they would go down to the pools of Siloam, which were fed by the Siloam runoff. The next piece of evidence deals with this guy, Pontius Pilate. Up until recently, people thought that the only evidence that we had for Pontius Pilate was either A, in the Bible, or B, a very brief citation by Tacitus, who was mentioned in the previous section. But recent archaeological digs, and by recent, again, I mean in the last 50 years, have found that there was an inscription of Pilate found in the region dated between AD 26 and 36. The inscription is found in the ancient city of Caesarea Philippi, which would have been part of the regions that Pontius Pilate was in charge of. And Pontius Pilate also dedicated this building to Tiberius Caesar, who was the current Caesar in charge when Jesus was crucified, corroborating 1, Pilate's existence, 2, him being in charge in that region, and 3, being in charge during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. The final piece of archaeological corroboration that we're going to discuss is the custom of crucifixion. Now, it wasn't disputed whether or not people were actually crucified, because it was clear that people were crucified, not only from what we have written in the Bible, but also Josephus talked much about people being crucified, especially when writing about the destruction of Jerusalem. However, what was assumed was that if people were crucified, they were such low-class citizens that they didn't get proper burials, which we don't see in the case of Jesus, who was buried and laid in a tomb. It was assumed that if you were crucified, you were thrown into a mass grave, and up until recently, people thought that perhaps this is reason to disbelieve the Gospels, because if Jesus was crucified, he wouldn't be allowed to be buried in a tomb. However, in 1968, there was someone who was doing an excavation of tombs, and they found the remains of a crucifixion victim named Yohanan ben Hagalgol. It's quite a mouthful of a name. And in what they found was that in his remains, it was clear that he had spikes driven into both feet and into the lower bones of the arms, showing that he was a crucifixion victim and nevertheless received a proper burial. So we also know that it was a custom for people who were crucified, or it's not unheard of that someone who would have been crucified would have been able to have a proper burial. So in summary, Quirinius, real guy. Lysanias, real guy. Both of them placed at the times that the Gospel authors said they would have been placed. Pool of Bethesda was a real place. The Pool of Siloam was a real place, again, discovered by archaeological findings. Pontius Pilate, not only mentioned in writing, but also now found in limestone inscriptions. And finally, the custom of crucifixion that would have been able to cast doubt on Jesus' burial also has been shown to not be a singular case. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that, again, we are talking about corroboration up here. We're not talking about hardcore proof that with these things alone we can prove that the Gospels are reliable, but nevertheless we're pointing towards corroboration, which means that we have testimony from the disciples, and all these pieces of archaeological evidence corroborate the story that we have and help us prove that the things that we heard from the Gospel writers are reliable. Okay, well, if it is the case that we have such good archaeological evidence, also counting the other eyewitness evidence that we had from earlier, why do some people still continue to deny that the gospel witnesses are trustworthy? Well, there are 3 objections that J. Warner Wallace discusses in this book. First, some original writings of ancient authors are missing, specifically speaking to people like Thales and Phlegon, the people who gave us information about the darkness that came over the earth when Jesus was crucified. Now, the issue that people have with Thales and Phlegon's writings is that they aren't found in their original context, but rather in quotes by Sextus Julius Africanus and Origen. But when we consider these things, we can realize that Thales and Phlegon were quoted by those guys to debate their claims, not to debate whether or not they actually said those claims. So, in the quotations by Africanus and Origen, we can trust that they are actually quoting Thales and Phlegon because they are quoting them accurately so that they can provide a rebuttal to their original arguments. So, even though we don't have Thales and Phlegon's original manuscripts, or even copies of their original manuscripts, the fact that Origen and Africanus quote them, we know what they said. Next, we have the objection that some of the gospel terms are still troublesome. This is directly referring to some of the content that the gospel writers have in the gospels. For example, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus talks about praying out loud in the synagogue. However, some people would say, experts in the ancient Near East would say, no, that custom of praying in the synagogues didn't happen until the year 70 AD. So, whoever wrote the Gospels were off because they're misquoting what would have actually been done in synagogues in that day. However, an assertion like this is riddled with assumption that we know everything about the first century Jewish practices, which clearly we do not. And simply by saying that we haven't figured out everything that there is to say about synagogue praying and we don't have any references to it before the year 70 AD doesn't prove that they didn't actually do that. It's just built off an assumption that we know everything there is to know off the first century. Some might say that this sounds like an argument from silence, that simply because we don't know, we're just going to assume that the Gospels are true. However, what we do have is that there's plenty of other evidence that we've pointed out already. There are plenty of other things that have corroborated the truth of the Gospel, that it's simply silly to assume that it's lying or not telling the truth when there is an area of history that we aren't completely certain of that the Gospels reference. Next, we come to the final objection that we're going to discuss in this chapter, and that is that archaeology cannot confirm every gospel detail. But when we look at archaeology, we notice that archaeology is only a small fraction of the amount of artifacts that we have from any given time. You have to remember that all of the evidence that we're looking at is approximately 2,000 years old, and those things have had to survive wars, have had to survive people not thinking they're important, being thrown away, having to survive different occupying forces coming in and destroying things over and over and over again, as we know from the history of Jerusalem and from the history of Israel in general. So, the things that we are able to corroborate with archaeology are just going to be a fraction of the entirety of what the Gospels claim. So the fact that archaeology cannot confirm every gospel detail is no surprise, because archaeology cannot confirm every detail of anything. So the amount of corroboration that we do have for the gospel accounts is definitely sufficient to know that they are reliable. Although it doesn't corroborate every last detail, the archaeology, the statements from other witnesses who are outside, what we do have is plenty of corroboration to be able to trust the Gospels.